Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Sapien Score. Today we are going to be taking a look at the 2022 game Cult of the Lamb. Cult of the Lamb is essentially an action roguelike hybrid with a base builder sim. So think something along the lines of Hades, if you're familiar with that game, crossed over with something similar to The Sims or to Stardew Valley. And while this sounds like quite a weird combo, in fact, it is quite a weird combo, somehow Cult of the Lamb does a pretty good job of taking two very distinct genres and essentially two very different games and combining them into one. The gameplay of Cult of the Lamb is split into two very distinct sections. One being the typical action roguelike aspect, which is the Crusades, in which you have a melee weapon and a series of spells that you can get, and you proceed through a number of dungeons, fighting enemies, and collecting power-ups along the way, known as tarot cards, all in efforts to defeat the boss of that particular dungeon. Apart from defeating enemies and bosses with a pretty simplistic melee combat system, along the way on these crusades, you are tasked with rescuing and then indoctrinating new members into your cult, as well as collecting a number of different resources which are used once you get back to your cult to build new structures, buildings, food plots, beds, and other amenities to take care of your cult members and make sure that their faith and loyalty remains high. If you're familiar with games such as The Sims, Zoo Tycoon, or Stardew Valley, then this second portion of the game, which is once you return from the Crusades with those materials and come back to your cult, are going to be right up your alley, since it's essentially a base building simulator. And while at first I was doubtful that this game would be able to really take two very distinct genres and meld them together, the more I played, the more I realized that it actually works out quite well. And I think this ultimately comes down to the fact that all of your upgrades and stats and attributes in the action roguelike crusade portion of the game are directly attributed to how good you are at managing your cult and recruiting followers, keeping them happy, and then performing the different rituals and sermons which allow you to upgrade your character's abilities, weapons, spells, and other attributes. I think the other main thing that this game has going for it is the stark contrast between the cutesy art style and the adorable character designs, contrasted with the very dark and sinister undertones that go into running your cult, such as the different rituals in which you're regularly sacrificing, murdering, and doing all kinds of kind of vile cultish behaviors in order to maintain the loyalty and maintain control over your cult members so that you can harvest them and upgrade your own abilities for the Crusades and your mission to kill each of the bosses. On top of the core gameplay, which is that 50-50 split between the action roguelike and the base building sim, there are some additional vendors and minigames, such as Knucklebones, which is a kind of basic dice game, but it's actually pretty fun, as well as the little fishing minigame to harvest resources. And as I've mentioned before, although it does a pretty good job of melding together the base builder plus the action roguelike, this combination kind of just serves as a gimmick and covers up for the fact that it doesn't do either of these particularly well. For example, on the action roguelike side, the combat system is serviceable, but it really is very shallow. And there's only a few weapons and they all play pretty much exactly the same. On top of that, in my opinion, the most critical part of any roguelike is the upgrades that you get along the way. And the tarot card system in this game is just extremely lackluster. And I feel that every single run I did felt pretty similar. The upgrades that you get from the tarot cards really don't change the gameplay too much, and they're typically just bonuses to health or damage output, and there's not really any cool abilities. On the base building side of things, I think this is definitely the stronger of the two portions of the game. However, by the end, I found myself getting a little sick of the kind of rote tasks and chores of keeping your followers in line and keeping the loyalty in check. And it was particularly annoying in my opinion, since some of the final bosses to the game require that you have a certain size cult. So if people start leaving because you can't keep the loyalty up, it really does set you back, and then you have to just grind for some more followers, which I found to be a bit of a chore. Overall, I found Cult of the Lamb to be an enjoyable game, but I think it was just mediocre, and that's just the best way to sum it up. While it was an interesting melding of two genres, and the art style and the general kind of theme of it I thought was really cool, I just don't think there's really too much within the game itself, gameplay-wise, that would keep me coming back. And once I finished it up in about 11 hours, I really had no desire to dive back in. So, with all that being said, I'm going to go ahead and give Cult of the Lamb a Sapien score of 7 bananas. There was some really fun boss fights, and I think that was the highlight of the game. However, the overall core gameplay fell a little flat to me. And while I did enjoy myself for a while, I think by the end, I just found the base building aspect to become a bit stale and a bit of a grind. And the action roguelike portion of the game, the combat really was lackluster, and there wasn't much depth. And honestly, not much replayability in my opinion. Anyways, that's pretty much it. Thanks for tuning on in, and I'll catch you next time. Adios, amigos.